Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to talk about console exclusive games, why I think they're bad for the industry. They kind of always have, but especially lately. Let's start off by talking about Square Enix. They are poised to lose a lot of money. I think I'd take like a $150 million loss. They're going to be restructuring and focusing on multi-platform games instead of doing console exclusives like they have with the PlayStation 5 recently. Apparently Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as well as something like Final Fantasy XVI, are not making them nearly enough money just being on the PlayStation 5. Part of the reason is because budgets are super inflated and AAA games really need to be scaled back. But that's another issue entirely I don't want to talk about today too much. I want to focus more on how developers that are tied to one console are limiting their scope. They are not getting nearly as much return for the work that they put in for their games. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the remake for extension really ought to be multi-platform so that we can see a better return for these developers that are working so hard to put out fantastic games. I'm not a huge fan of the Final Fantasy series in general. I think I've only ever finished one game, and it was like the original game getting ported over to iOS. So I don't have a big horse in the race, but I do like what Square Enix makes. I think they do make a fantastic product typically, especially with the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy series. And I don't want them to go under because of their exclusivity with PlayStation. I think it's very telling when you see a second party studio like this that has a major association with someone like Sony or Microsoft, and they go under because they don't have as much reach because they're not making as much profit. It just doesn't really make sense to me. Let's go back to the PlayStation 1 era and I guess the extension of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox era. So back when Sony was entering the console race, it made a lot of sense for them to have exclusives, especially deals with people like Square Enix, because they were new to the market. Nintendo had all the Square Enix games. They had Final Fantasy on their Nintendo systems, but when the PlayStation came around and they started using discs, Sony reached out, and Square Enix, they made a deal and they said, okay, we're going to make our games on the PlayStation instead of the Nintendo 64. And that got a lot of people to shift over to Sony's console, my brother-in-law included, because Final Fantasy was a big deal for them. And the upgraded graphics meant that they're going to have better games overall. And so despite Nintendo making fantastic experiences, a lot of people jumped ship because of the promise of a lot of great exclusives. You had other things like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro that were just so synonymous with the PlayStation brand. Same thing happened with Xbox when they launched. They were new to the console race, and so they put out Halo, and then later on they had Gears of War and the 360. These exclusives were pivotal for them to sell their hardware. Because they were new to the market, they really needed a banger IP, otherwise they weren't going to be able to get a market share and actually start making consoles for the future as well. So they needed to capture that market share early on so they could have some momentum going into the next generations. And Nintendo is the same way. Their IPs, they have been really protective of them because they have done a great job of selling consoles for them. Not always. We've seen things like the Nintendo 64, the GameCube. It didn't sell as well, but decently. Then you have the Wii U. It had great exclusive games, but it sold absolutely terribly because the marketing was bad for it. So exclusives can be really important for a system, but they're not always the most important thing. We can look at Microsoft consoles as well. The Xbox One is the primary reason they don't have as big a market share nowadays. It's not quite only like the exclusive, not having exclusives on their console, although that is a thing. A lot of Xbox gamers would love to have more exclusives on their consoles. But I think the biggest reason the Xbox Series X isn't on par or a little bit less than the PlayStation 5 in terms of sales, and it's lagging really far behind, is because the Xbox One really just killed their momentum with the announcement of the all-in-one machine and the way that they marketed it and gave Sony the leg up because they charged more. I think their mistakes on the Xbox One era of games was really the problem that has now put them on the back foot, because more people adopted the PlayStation 4 and they had kept the momentum going with the PlayStation 5. People are just now familiar with the Sony ecosystem, so they're just happy to buy the next PlayStation console instead of the Xbox console. There were lots of people that bled over from the Xbox 360 into the Xbox One because they loved their 360. They just kept their loyalty to that base there. But not as many people stayed with the company because Xbox One was what it was. By the end of the generation, the Xbox One was great. The Xbox One X was awesome. It was on par or even better than the PlayStation 4 Pro. So it's I think a lot of the time we equivocate console exclusives with how well a console does, and it's not always the case. Like I said, back on the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube, they had some killer exclusive games that were some of the best games that we've ever seen. Ocarina of Time is the killer app on the Nintendo 64, along with stuff like Mario 64 and Star Fox. We had some incredible experiences there, but people just didn't buy it as much. GameCube had Resident Evil 4, one of the best video games of all time. Same with Metroid Prime, Wind Waker. We had some incredible titles on that console, some of my very favorites to this day. But it didn't matter because the competition was doing better with marketing and pushing their stuff out, keeping their momentum going. So I don't think exclusives really tell the full story. And I think nowadays, console exclusives just don't make sense for the market. I know I've given Microsoft some grief the last little bit, especially for shutting down Tango Gameworks, for putting out a hit and then closing their studio anyway. But what I will say about Microsoft, I like what they're doing, is that they're pumping their games out from Xbox exclusives over to the PlayStation. And I think they're going to be doing that more because they see the value, not only for them and how they're going to be making some more money, which is important for a company, but also for their studios that are needing to be recognized for their hard work. The more sales you get on other platforms means more security for the studios, at least in theory. I know we didn't see that with Tango Gameworks, but I have some hope that other games that get ported over to the PlayStation 5 will then get some new life breathed into the games, or a bunch more success, so the studio has some more security. And I would love to see that with other developers too. I know Sony has been putting their games onto PC, which is a nice step in the right direction. At least they're getting their exclusives on another platform. So now all the PC gamers can experience stuff like God of War and Spider-Man. I think that's really fantastic. It's a good step, but it's not enough for me. I want to see all exclusives go to other consoles as well. At the very least, I think second-party exclusives need to stop being a thing. These studios that are heavily associated with a platform, like I said, Square Enix with Sony, need to stop being associated with one platform. Let's get as many games as we can on as many platforms as we can. If it's only available on PlayStation, Xbox, because the Switch is underpowered, hopefully the Switch 2 will be able to have feature parity so that we can have more experiences across all the consoles on the market. I want to see more people experience games. I hate asking my friends like, hey, have you played this game on the Switch? And they're like, I don't have a Switch, man. I'm like, oh, yeah, you got to go buy a Switch. And I know that means a several $100 investment so they can go get the console and then buy games. It's really tough to get anybody to do that for any console. So I would love to just see those games be on multiple platforms. I know Nintendo is very protective of their IPs. Same with Sony to some degree. No one's more protected than Nintendo. They have all sorts of issues with copywriting and making sure that people are getting ROMs offline. Well, I'll talk about that issue a little bit later. I think it's important for us to see that companies like Nintendo and Sony are not American companies. They are Japanese companies, so the culture and the values are different. And so judging them from our perspective doesn't really work across the board. I don't agree with some of the decisions they make, especially with emulation from Nintendo's side of things, but I understand that they operate differently because they operate in a different country where everything is different. So I think it's important to recognize that it is their right as well to hold on to their IPs so tightly. They want to protect them because they see them as so valuable. But I would love to see every exclusive across the board. This is what I would love to have happen for first-party exclusives specifically. I would love for them to launch on, let's say, PlayStation. Let's say the new God of War game comes out on PlayStation. Give it a year exclusivity. I think that's plenty of time for you to not only sell the software, but sell people on your hardware. It's going to give you plenty of time to get a lot of the hardware sales. People that don't want to wait for this game will absolutely jump in and buy the console. And then they will have a PlayStation console, and then they can just keep buying software on it. After a year, when sales start to, peter off a little bit, you have another resurgence, some more hype, because now it's launching on Xbox after 1 year exclusivity. God of War on Xbox would go crazy and people would buy it up like hotcakes because it's a great game, because people would be excited about it, especially that it's coming to a rival platform. It would give another wave of hype to this game, and sales would soar. I bet sales would also increase on the PlayStation as well because interest in the property is going up. This would be a huge, huge deal. Same thing with Microsoft going to other consoles. I love when Microsoft started porting stuff like Cuphead and Ori and the Blind Forest over to the Switch. It was amazing amazing. It was a resurgence of hype and a huge translation to sales for the games. And it made the companies a lot of money. That's what I want to see. These studios need to be recognized for the hard work that they're doing. And if they can get it on multiple platforms, then there's more hype for everybody. Everybody gets to experience these great titles. If we had 1-year exclusivity deals, then we get multiple platforms enjoying the same games. So when I talk to my friend that only plays on Xbox, I can say, hey, did you play the new God of War game? No, I didn't, because it's only on PlayStation. But no, it just launched on Xbox. You go try it out. And then we can talk about it and get excited. And then there's more interest in the IPs. The developers get more praise and they get more success because of it. I just think it's a win-win across the board. Now, if we look at Nintendo right now, you can absolutely say that their exclusives are part of the big reason that they are succeeding, which is true. You have Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom doing gangbuster numbers, Smash Brothers, of course. You have all these IPs that are definitely contributing to how well the Switch is doing. But also the Switch is unique hardware. It's not really competing against anything now that like Steam Decks and portable PCs have come out. That's their new competition. But before that, they weren't really competing with Sony and Microsoft. They were doing their own thing and getting a lot of success because of it. I don't know that the Switch 2 is going to be nearly as successful if it's just an iteration of the Switch 1, because the Switch 1 was so novel. The fact that Sony and Microsoft haven't put out a handheld to compete with it might be the reason that it's going to keep on going and have so much momentum. And the games definitely tell us part of that story. But I think the Switch hardware itself is a bigger player in why the Switch is so successful. It's a fantastic indie machine, it has some pretty decent third-party support, and it's got great games, of course. But Nintendo does their own thing no matter what they do, and so sometimes the gimmick is what sells their consoles more than anything. If you look at the Wii, that's absolutely the case. The Wii U, not so much. It was not as well accepted, and so people didn't buy it, despite having great games. So I don't think exclusives tell the whole story, and I would love to see exclusives go multi-platform so that everyone can enjoy them, so that we can all have a great experience as gamers. I would love to see gamers come together more. I think the console war discussion really has been finished for a while and should be if you're still thinking about it. Console fanboyism is really kind of cringe. And I know, because I was that person until even just a few years ago. Started to change my viewpoint because I would see creators like the Actman talk about their experiences with all these classic Xbox games that they grew up with and played, and why they're so great or why they're not so great for some of like the later Halo games. And watching his videos, it made it clear that he was a huge fan of Microsoft consoles, but he wasn't like a fanboy. He was just saying like these games were incredible, and the way he talked about them made me want to go get an old Xbox and go play them. And that's exactly what I want to see. I want to see us just really come together and stop fanboying over one console and getting really excited about the PlayStation or the Switch or the Xbox, and just say gaming is awesome. Let's celebrate gaming on whatever platform you have. If you're playing on PC, if you're playing on console, if you're playing on the go with a portable PC, great. Let's be excited as gamers and just come together instead of being against each other, because that's just really lame. And I think for the most part, people are getting away from that because it is kind of cringy. And I just would love to see more games on more consoles, and so that everybody can experience them. That's what I want to talk about today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.